Fox, Jim White, and myself, Aviva Romani. And Mary Jo was the founder of Echo Art South Florida. She's an art historian and curator, and she worked on that project for 7 years. This is in no particular order. Well, I guess it is alphabetical.
I'm used to it.
James Fox is a postdoc at Oregon State University. He's a microbiologist. He's working on fish and plankton contaminations. Correct me if I'm wrong about any of this. And our perennial Jim White is the dean of, well, he's our resident optimist. And he's also the dean of arts and sciences at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And he has been on the forefront of remediation research about how plants can mitigate climate change. Pardon me. And something that Jim and I did together in 2013 with Jean Turner, who couldn't make it today, was calculate exactly how much green mitigation could outbalance climate change. And at that time, we calculated it would be 36%. And since then, it would be way more. And even then, we didn't have enough land mass to produce 36% regreening. And Mary Jo brought up the question a couple weeks ago of some scientists who are working on a similar issue and whether they knew about our little project. So that brought up the question in my mind. We often talk about how science influences artists, but we don't talk as much about how art may influence scientists. So, Mary Jo, I know that you've been thinking about this a lot because you're working on a book, and one of the points you made to me a couple weeks ago was that what you noticed was very often the artists do the preliminary research on a topic. They aren't recognized for that work, but then the ideas are picked up by scientists. So I wonder if you could summarize some of your recent thinking on that topic.
Well, my book project involves taking a very close reading of 10 particular ecological art projects that I've selected because I think they point the way to a new kind of practice. So one of the things that I have been noticing in the course of my investigations of these 10 projects, all of which have been done, since 2000, or probably be 2000, 2005. So they're very contemporaneous to our own work. And I think what I've noticed is less that the artists are not recognized and more that, and I guess you could say it's not recognized, but it's more that if some kind of innovation occurs in the process of an artist working on a project, whether they're doing a full collaboration or simply consulting the knowledge base or the particular scientists that they have selected to work with or try to work with, it's less, in my opinion, that they're ignored and more that the scientists or the, not the hard scientists, but the people who, like the engineers and the landscape architects and the people that are doing restoration in the field are unlikely to continue to use the innovation again. This is almost the case in every single project where there has been direct involvement of the artist with the scientific community, such as it was. I don't have any that are other than you that are involved with research scientists, Aviva. But in the
Mary
others,
Jo, before you go on, can you be a bit more specific about what you mean by saying that an artist might initiate something, but then it's not continued by the scientists?
right. So this is, again, we really need to not talk about scientists in the sense of research scientists, because these examples are more with when artists have worked with field restoration people, engineers, and that sort of thing. But I'll give you a very good example. Frances Whitehead worked in Chicago with a team of engineers from the city of Chicago to do some phytoremediation on a former gas station site. And the innovation that she came up with was to utilize a road building machine to mix the soil to a depth of 4 feet, which was would have to be necessary in order not to remove all of the gravel that was on the site, because the gravel, if it were left alone without being mixed with compost and so forth, the soil would be far too alkaline in order to harbor the plants that they were trying to do the research on for phytoremediation. So she came up with this idea. Nobody had ever thought about using that particular tool in that particular way. And that was the major innovation, in addition to her suggestion of some phytoremediation plants that had never been used before. That did not continue. In other words, there are over 150 sites like that in polluted sites in the city of Chicago. And the innovations could easily have been taken to other sites. However, that did not happen. And the reason it didn't happen, again, it's not the fault of the engineers or the research scientists. It's just the way things are. The city got a new mayor. He immediately canceled the environmental research office, which housed all of these engineers. The engineers were farmed out to a lot of other places, and they just went on digging and dumping into landfills the way they had been doing before, rather than mixing the soil on site. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. In terms of the actual plants, the 12 new phytoremediation plants that she came up with, that was never continued either, because the research scientist at Purdue, who was working with her, moved to another university, and he decided not to continue the research there, and nobody continued in Chicago at Purdue. So, basically that was lost. So I'm finding that is more often the case than innovations not being recognized. I suppose you could say it's kind of not being recognized, but it's more just everybody is used to doing things a certain way, and they just move back to where their comfort level is, or there's political issues that make it impossible to continue to apply these kinds of innovations.
Well, it's really too bad that Gene isn't here, because I think this is all right up his alley in terms of sensible approaches specifically to restoration and what gets in the way, especially when what gets in the way is political. But I do think that one of the issues in giving artists the credibility to allow ideas to go forward, or certain kinds of innovative research to continue, is that in the sciences there is such a strict hierarchy of how research is published, how it is recognized, how it is cited, and then how those ideas might be adopted and developed. So I wonder whether either Jim or James would like to comment on that.
Go ahead, James.
You go ahead to begin with. And you're probably more versed in this kind of thing, so you can lead the conversation.
Well, so Aviva, are you asking, whether there are structural impediments to having scientists.
Actually 2 or 3 different things, and you can take your pick about what might be interesting to you to respond to. One is about whether or not scientists are willing, when it happens, to cite the influence of an artist on their own research and work. The second is the extent to which the professional structure of the sciences really makes it impossible for innovations to come in from expert witnesses, in effect, that are outside the professional silo. The third, I guess, is how does this screw things up? If there might be viable ideas like Francis's idea with the soil mixing, and then they just get routinely tossed out because it's not the way they've always done things, that's a loss.
So I guess in my experience, the scientists are open to new ideas. They're open to new approaches. We're in the business of trying to prove that somebody else is wrong. That's what we do for a living. And so there's always that kind of openness to thinking, outside the box, because that frequently leads to discovery, and that frequently leads to all the things you want. I think where it goes off the rails, quite honestly, is the reward structure in science is pretty well defined, and it does not include art. So when we write papers, when we go forward for tenure and promotion, when we do all the stuff that we do, the collaborations with artists may not count. That's problem number one. And if they're not part of the reward structure, then it's altogether too easy for a scientist to not credit the artist in anywhere near the way that they should. And so that's where, from a science point of view, that's where our system, I think, breaks down. We're a collection of disciplines, but we have a common set of rules by which we operate. And those rules have evolved at a time when there wasn't that much interaction between science and art. And so art was not part of that, not part of the reward process or of the evaluation process. Now, having said all that, it doesn't have to stay that way. I mean, we've managed to embrace interdisciplinarity in science in ways that's pretty impressive. But I would say that, if you had to sort of put a knock on science, it is that we've not been able to branch out nearly as much as we should have. We should have taken that freedom of inquiry idea and applied it far more broadly and far more widely than we have.
So to offer my 2 cents, and I think from a scientific point of view, in terms of the structure of our approaches and delivering our outputs, Jim will probably have much more to offer in terms of the funding and the publishing and things like that, how that becomes intertwined with art. But I think from my experience in the UK and the US, the way that funding structures and the major funding bodies are now starting to talk to science and tell them how they want to structure the use of their funds, I think there's this encouragement to broaden the horizons, that you need your science to apply to much more than just the scientific community. There are now, you now basically need to document how your science is going to be embraced by the public, how it's going to be made accessible to the public, how it's going to impact daily lives, and maybe there's a way that the arts can factor into this. But I think the problem at the moment is it's not encouraging art science collaborations in terms of the methodologies and the approaches. I think it's more about the way that, or the way I see it, it's more about the communication. Science, obviously, at the moment, it's all kind of ivory tower-esque, where we have our results and we keep them to ourselves or within our community. But I think there is the opportunity to work alongside the arts community and reach a wider audience through different methods and through a different mouthpiece. Within my department, we have a very art-friendly department head, because she's a local artist herself, and she recently commissioned one of the PhD students to do a kind of music piece about the science of her lab, and she's done that multiple times, and she encourages art pieces around the department and scientific art pieces. But at the moment, I don't think it goes to the kind of funding and grant awarding level. I think at the moment it's more, I don't know, small communities that are willing to encourage arts through their own means.
I'll give you an example. So the National Science Foundation, when we write proposals to the National Science Foundation, they have a requirement that you address broader impacts.
Yeah, exactly.
And honestly, people fill that out and then it's roundly ignored. It doesn't have teeth. So it's as if the idea is there, but the enforcement of the idea or the building it into the culture is not where it should be. Mm-hmm. Science is about as close to dinosaurs as you can get in terms of our ability to adapt and evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
There's also, I think, the issue of confirmation bias. I'm thinking of a conversation I had with my first supervisor, Angelica Hilbeck, who was a predator-prey biologist for my dissertation. And she once commented that she had mentioned to a colleague that she was doing the supervision with an artist. And they basically said something like, well, gee, you must have a lot of free time.
Yeah.
But that's an incredibly insulting thing to say.
Yeah.
And it's just normal, as far as I can tell, that there's a tremendous denigration of what artists do or how artists can contribute. I often complain that many scientists see the arts as handmaidens to the work of scientists, which is very often women artists being handmaidens to men scientists, and all the funding goes to the scientists. Even when, as in the case of Francis or other artists, it's the artists that are coming up with the actual research innovations. Mary Jo, you had a specific...
I don't know what happened to my video. It went away. Let's see.
Oh, you're still there. We can still see you.
Oh, well, I can't see you, though. This is very disconcerting.
Oh, there's someplace where you can click to the speaker view. If you go up to usually it's the top right corner.
I don't have
move your cursor.
I don't have a Mac. I have a PC.
Yeah, but even so, if you move your cursor around, you should be able to find the rest of us.
Well, anyway, go ahead and ask me. I'll try to see what I did. I didn't mean to do that. Okay, so you were asking me what?
You wanted to ask Jim about whether our research.
Right. So I guess the way Alvima explained the 36% and my reaction to it was a little bit different than I think what I had meant. So let me just clarify. When I saw, and Jim, you probably know this very well, there's a group of scientists that did some work on natural approaches to reducing carbon. Are you familiar with that work? It was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences last year, or maybe
Last year, yeah, I think so, yeah.
Okay, so in there they said that according to the research that they did, and I'm not sure that they did original research, they were probably just going through, you know, all the studies and kind of coming up with this, but it's been covered in the press a lot, in the sort of not in science press, but just the regular press a lot since then. And essentially what they're saying is that 36% of the greenhouse gases can be reduced. Not that you need 36% or more of the land mass covered with new green, but that by simply taking an natural approach, which is agriculture, how much of that land has to be rethought, reorganized, reconsidered. But that if this is done rapidly, that you could gain from natural ways, natural approaches, 36% of what we need, where we need to go in order to bring our temperature down to less than 2 degrees centigrade. So that's a little bit different than what I think, what I understood you to, and Aviva to have come up with during the fish story project.
So,
oh, okay, you're there.
Yeah, you keep freezing up, Mary Jo, by the way, so
Oh, I wish I could figure out what I've done wrong here. Maybe I need to go out and come back in or something.
Well, you're good now, so hang on. So
Okay.
The other thing, Mary Jo, is you can close all the other programs that might be on your computer running right now and just have this on. That might help.
That's Daisy.
yeah, there's sometimes it's bandwidth issues, Mary Jo. So.
Yeah, okay, well, I don't want to do that because I'm afraid I'll get off altogether. So if you can just continue, bear with me. I'm sorry.
Well, so there may not be much of a difference between those two ways of explaining the ability of land plants and actually ocean plants as well to soak up some of our excess carbon. At its simplest level, you know roughly how much carbon is being produced from fossil fuels, excess carbon going into the atmosphere. You know how much carbon is available in land plants, and you can do a couple simple calculations from that. The one you're talking about, Mary Jo, is a year by year kind of thing. Like, you know, if we put 10 gigatons of carbon up in the atmosphere, how many gigatons can we remove by growing more plants? The number that I came up with some time ago was if you took all the coal, oil, and natural gas and you converted it to CO2 and put it in the atmosphere, how many biospheres would we need to suck that back out of the atmosphere? And the answer, and interestingly, the answer sounds as though it's about the same. It's about a third. You need, in other words, you would need 3 more terrestrial biospheres to take up the carbon that we have available to us in coal, oil, and natural gas. Which is another way of saying that, all right, if you mitigate carbon emissions today by growing more coal, by growing more plants, or by biochar or whatever, is there a limit to that? And the answer to that would be probably yes, there is a limit to that, because there's way more carbon in coal, oil, and natural gas than there is in all living carbon on the planet. And that, what that says is that, you know, eventually you've got to find other ways to sequester that carbon. Does that make sense?
Yeah. See,
I mean,
now I was kind of thinking that was the case.
it's a you know,
It's just the way that, since I'm trying to write about Aviva's work, Blue Trees, I'm not writing about Fish Store, I'm writing about Blue Trees.
yeah,
But the issue of sequestering carbon comes into play there as well, because obviously if you stop the removal of trees in the path of pipelines, that's, you know, one way to stop, you know, to increase carbon sink. But I was just, the reason I contacted her is because I was confused, because I saw those two 36%.
mm-hmm.
And I was going, okay, so this doesn't sound exactly like what she was saying, and I didn't have the benefit of talking to you, so I really wasn't sure what that was all about. Not that I would even include this in the book. I mean, it's just for my own understanding. You know, I don't think it's necessary to include this in the discussion that I'm doing for my book.
I think it's, you know, just from a sort of a simple understanding point of view, I think it's helpful for people to understand scale. So for example, for people to know that there's way more carbon in coal, oil, and natural gas than there is in all trees, bushes, you know, you name it, that they can see out there, that scales things for them a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, you know, one of the hardest things that we have to express to people. And I think one of the greatest contributions that art has made and can make is getting people to see things that they have trouble visualizing, or get them to not see them, but to appreciate things that people have trouble visualizing. I've told Aviva this story, but when my kids were young and we would go on vacation, we would drive out Interstate 80 through Nebraska. My wife refused to fly, by the way, which is why we drove. And along Interstate 80 are train tracks going from the Wyoming coal fields back to the industrial areas of the East. And I remember just being dumbfounded by the trains when they went by, because it would take that train 30 minutes to go by. I mean, imagine a train taking 30 minutes to go by. And it was just coal, one car after another of coal. Mm-hmm. And to me, this was, you know, a great way to try to understand just how, you know, how much carbon we take out of the ground every day and ship off to get burned. I mean, it was just amazing to me how big these trains were and how much coal was in those trains.
I think it's worth clarifying, at least with Blue Trees, that there are two issues. One is to sustain some forest contiguity, which is one of the purposes of the project, or one of the takeaways from the project. And the other is to stop the use of fossil fuels. I want to go back to this question of how artists impact science, and specifically address conversation, because a lot of the kinds of influences we're talking about come out of conversations like the ones that we're having right now. And I was thinking about all the work that you and I have done, Jim, since 2007. And I would say the two predictive insights that were most important that came out of our conversations were, first of all, in 2007, that migration patterns were just going to overwhelm all democratic systems, because it was going to be at a scale that nobody could anticipate or compensate for. And the other was the 36% from Fish Story. So my question is, if we were so effective in predicting outcomes, really just from conversations and the artwork that was generated out of the conversations, isn't this a terrible loss? And if anybody had paid attention to the really specific data we came up with about migration patterns in 2007, we might have started a conversation on a broader scale that could have been pretty useful. And if people had paid attention to the simple calculations we did from Fish Story, let alone any of the research you did before that, we might have started on a more realistic path about fossil fuels and forest contiguity. So it's just striking to me that there's this huge black hole of potential knowledge that just disappears.
Well, it's a, I mean, it's hard to get too bent out of shape about it because it's a very common pattern that knowledge is produced and sometimes just is very obvious that this is right, and yet people find ways to willfully ignore it and or shove it aside. You know, climate change is a is a real thorny problem, and we know that it's, you know, we know the physics, and yet people are, you know, able to deny even basic physics. There's some, in my opinion, some even more striking examples. You know, when we put tetraethyl lead in gasoline back in the early 1900s, there were many physicians who spoke out and said this was an incredibly dumb idea, that you would be taking lead, you put it into a fuel, you drive cars around in cities, and you're going to be polluting cities, which at the time were, you know, there's more and more people were moving into cities. You're going to be polluting kids with lead. You're going to be basically poisoning generations of children with lead. And we did. And it took 40 or 50 years to get lead out of gasoline. But we knew right away that this was a remarkably bad idea. And there's, you know, there are many examples of this, you know, there are vested interests who wanted to keep lead in gasoline because they were making a ton of money mining lead and selling it. And the automobile manufacturers wanted it because they didn't have an easy replacement. They couldn't make the engines keep from knocking without it. There was a whole bunch of financial reasons why they wanted to keep lead in gasoline. And they were able to just completely ignore the impacts that this would have on a generation of children. And you know, we're in a very similar situation now. We're gaily spewing huge quantities of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. We're passing all the problems, pretty much all the problems, onto children and grandchildren, and we seem to be able to sleep at night. Or we don't, but other people do.
They sleep very well.
They sleep very well. And you know, to me, this is, there's something very human about this that I don't like, that I don't completely understand. And, you know, my catharsis has always been, you know, to think of, you know, what are other ways in which we can communicate? I'm the optimist. You said it before. I remain convinced that if people understood what the problem was in a fundamental way, that they would respond. And I think it's, you know, so part of the problem is one of communication. And communication, as you and I have discussed many times, is not just me writing an equation on a board or drawing a picture of CO2 or drawing a molecule of CO2. It's getting people to connect in ways that make impact. And that's art.
Well, something that I'm slightly disappointed about today was I met a young woman named Helena, and I can't remember her last name. Daisy, you might remember what her last name was. And I think she was going back to Finland today. But her area was mathematical probability, but she's also an artist. And what I wanted her to specifically join us to talk about was how mathematical probability might relate to Maxwell's demon. And just to remind anybody who doesn't know what Maxwell's demon was, it was proposed by James Clerk Maxwell in the late 19th century that you could possibly contradict the second law of thermodynamics in a hypothetical idea model if you had a small demon who could sort the molecules in a closed system. And what was interesting about that was that there was an information organizational element, and ultimately that simple idea, that idea model, became the basis for information technology. Because what people finally figured out was that the work of reorganizing was as substantive as any other source of energy. So the reason that has fascinated me ever since is because it implies that if you can identify the most critical information in any given system, you can leverage that identification to change the entire system. So it's not just a question of communication in general, it's very specifically, how do you identify which information is going to have a probable outcome, which is not always obvious.
No, it's the, you know, in a simple way, it's the ability to separate signal from noise. Signal's what you're after.
James, I'm really interested in your thoughts as we've been talking, because you haven't spoken that much. But I know that some of these ideas were relatively new to you when we met at the College Art Association, but you were very interested in connecting with artists who are working on climate science or climate change. And I wondered what thoughts have been going through your mind while we've been talking.
Yeah, so I suppose I should introduce myself and what I do, as I think you know each other a little bit more. So I started during my early career, I was a toxicologist, and that's why I look into fish, I looked at fish, and then I worked in aquaculture for a little bit, and then I did a PhD over in the UK and moved into phytoplankton and the marine and global carbon cycle, and moved over here last year to start working on these projects that are largely focused on the ocean contribution to carbon cycling. And the reason I came and spoke to you is because recently I've become more interested in science communication and the role that we have all of the knowledge, as Jim alluded to. I mean, we know it all, but we have a very good idea of what we're doing, how the atmosphere or how the biosphere is going to react to future anthropogenic influence and things like that. But the word doesn't seem to be spreading to the entire population, or at least it's not being entirely taken up, and the actions that need to start taking place aren't, they're not happening. And so I was interested, so I've started working with organizations around where I live to increase, or to pursue different forms of science communication through work at museums and things like that. And I think that's an effective way to communicate directly with the public, to make them aware of these, of what we know, and direct communication. But I was intrigued to talk to the artists because of what Jim was saying. I mean, there's a large amount of communication that I think can be conveyed in a different way through art compared to science. And even to the point where you're thinking about the philosophy of how we consider nature and things like that. The current paradigm doesn't seem to be working. The way that we consider nature, it's been commodified and over the past century or so. And I think once it became commodified, it's just increasingly become exploited. And so I think if we can start to change the way that people even see, nature and the world and the resources that we utilize, can we make them see the problems in a different light? And I think art has a powerful, voice or role to play in that kind of shift in public perception of the environmental problems that we're currently facing. Because it comes back, I mean, if you go back to earlier in the conversation, I think there are mitigating projects that you can try and encourage, but sometimes the mitigation is not really, it's helpful and it's a good way forward, and these kind of things need to happen. There need to be these little projects that keep on chipping away at the big problem, but I don't think there's going to be a huge change unless there's this societal shift in mindset towards consumption and energy and all of these other things. And I think therefore you need to change the dialogue, and I think art can be a powerful mode or medium in which we can try and.
This brings up I think a controversial area that Aviva and some of the rest of us have been talking about, which is the role of art as illustration
Mm-hmm.
of scientific principles or scientific findings. And my sense is that artists, especially artists like Aviva, who are very, very serious about engaging art and science together in a transdisciplinary fashion, not an interdisciplinary fashion, is just, she's just on the cutting edge in terms of thinking about that. And I am questioning whether she actually has even achieved it. Which is not saying anything bad. I mean, it's just, it's just still out there. But as we think about transdisciplinary activity, we're talking about something that's a great deal more than illustration, a great deal more than communication, in the sense that Jim was talking about it. This is you and Jim, for example. I'll put you all on the spot for a second. You and Jim have been collaborating now for 12 years. And I want to ask you a very rude question. And that is, from both of you, do you really think that you have achieved a transdisciplinary outcome in any way? And if so, what are they? Truly transdisciplinary. Now, I'm not talking about Jim helping Aviva understand something, or Aviva explaining something that Jim knows. I'm talking about something that happens that is new as a result of the working together. And if it hasn't happened, I think that's okay. We can just say it hasn't happened yet. But I think we need to be careful about claiming that we have done transdisciplinary projects or that we have had transdisciplinary outcomes when we have not. There's nothing wrong with it being, with transdisciplinarity being a goal still,
Mm-hmm.
and that we haven't reached it yet. But I am concerned about the claim that transdisciplinariness or transdisciplinarity has happened between Jim and Aviva.
Let me just quickly try to respond, and then I'm very, of course, interested in Jim's response. Transdisciplinarity has been described as the space between silos and disciplines. So I think in our work together, or in any work I might do that I would consider transdisciplinary, there are three stages. One is the process of investigation. Second is the insight that comes from that process. And then the third is the actualization in some form. So I would say that, for example, in the film that we did, Trigger Point, Tipping Points, where we analyzed deltaic regions in relation to climate change and conflict zones, we were pretty good, pretty spot on identifying exactly, Egypt specifically, where there would be the next serious climate conflict that was precipitated by climate change. And I think that we couldn't have come to that conclusion about 36% if we hadn't been trying to work together in a transdisciplinary manner. I wouldn't have come to it myself. I don't know, Jim, whether you did those calculations on your own. And then the third is the actualization. And I would say that my current project, Blue Trees, is very much a product of all those years of transdisciplinary conversations and small insights and big insights that led me to creating some sort of a system that challenges the legal system. So I would say that that is transdisciplinary. Now, Mary Jo, you may have a different definition, but first I'd like to hear what Jim has to say.
I think it's a great question, Mary Jo, and I guess the simple answer would be that I agree with Aviva. I'm not sure that Blue Trees would have happened without years of conversation, and I'm not taking any credit for it at all. But it's the two of us sort of set each other up to go down pathways that we might not have gone down otherwise. And I think the same is true on my side. The institute that I directed up until a couple of years ago, Institute of Arctic and Alpine Research, we have a number of collaborations with artists now in the Arctic, including Netflix buying content from us. And that would not have happened, probably, again, you don't know, without extended conversations that we have had over the years. I think that, and I guess one of the things that sort of struck me, Mary Jo, was the, I don't know that Aviva and I, other than that first project we took on, which resulted in the Delta work, I don't know that we've approached this with a goal-oriented view, right? Like, we're going to do this, and this is what's going to come out of it. There have been a number of actions that have occurred over the years, and we occasionally get all excited about a specific thing, and then off we go and do that. But quite frankly, the space with which artists plus scientists get to operate is not large. It's not a built-up, normalized space within society, and so it has been far easier for us to have these interactions and then go off and inoculate. Aviva goes off and does stuff in the art community. I go off and do stuff in the scientific community. But we take with us a lot of the ideas and interactions that we've had through the years. So it's, I wish we were in a place where there was a lot more opportunity. And maybe, James, in your career, you will have this wonderful opportunity to be able to to find the funding, to find the opportunities to do a bunch of really interesting and cool things between science and art. I'd say probably about 20% of what Aviva and I talk about is, there is how hard it is to find that money and those opportunities. And honestly, there was a time probably 6 or 7 years ago when we were, openly talking about, should we be doing this anymore? We're frustrated. We can't find more funding. And I think at that point we came to the conclusion, you know what? It's still good to have the conversations. We're not getting any younger, but it's still good to have the conversations. So I don't know. I mean, that's not really a full answer to your question, but I think in a way your question is asking for something that really, we understood years ago was not going to be, the end all and be all of what we did. The end all and be all of what we do is more of a we bounce ideas, we support each other. It's kindred souls that need each other, really. I mean, I'd feel a great loss if I didn't have the opportunity to interact with Aviva, to interact with Marta Kern, to interact with Carrie Kepping, other artists that I interact with. I would feel a loss. Now, have I transformed the world in doing that? No, but that wasn't the goal. So I don't know. Does that help?
Well, yes, I think it does. Again, I just, because I have to write this book,
Yeah.
these questions do occur to me. It's like, are we really claiming something that maybe is not quite there yet? And I don't think there's anything wrong with artists claiming something that isn't there yet, because that's what artists do all the time. It's part of the way that artists work is just to, be out there on the edge. In fact, that's the title of my book, Living on the Edge. So, I think that's fine. I hadn't had an opportunity to kind of ask you two together about the concept of transdisciplinarity, which is something that I think a lot of artists, not only Aviva, but many artists that are trying to work in this area are trying to inhabit that space, that tiny space between the silos, because I think the thought is, or the hope is perhaps, that if we can expand that space a little bit, and it will of course require resources to do that, then perhaps the walls of the silos are not quite as tall as we think they are, and there will be more opportunities. But I think all of the limitations that both of you, is it Jim? Do I have two Jims? Two Jameses?
You have a James and a Jim.
We have a James and a Jim. So I think that James's point also about the importance of communicating existing science is certainly important. But I think that many serious artists, true intellectuals like Aviva and others, some of whom are in my book, would kind of chafe at that idea that they were supposed to be illustrating what you came up with,
No,
and that's supposed to be communicating what you came up with. I mean, I think that
more than chafe
that we're concerned, that I'm concerned with in my book, would probably want to argue with you about that and say, no, we have to break down the silos, period.
That's what I'm not saying. I'm saying that it's not about that. I'm saying that by having these these relationships between, it's about understanding the entire concept. I don't want to just take an artist and convey my science and tell them, okay, make this more accessible to the public. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the arts and the humanities have a way of thinking about the world historically that I think scientists don't in the same kind of way. And I think it's about changing the topic of the conversation, or the way that the conversation is directed. I think it's exactly what Jim says, that maybe they don't have a tangible product as such, or they don't have an outcome that they can say that this is exactly what we've achieved. But by having this dialogue, you ultimately inform each other, and it changes your way of thinking.
Jim has just signaled that he's about to vacate. You always manage to slip out a minute or two before the end.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you all so much for putting this together.
So Mary Jo, did you get a glimpse there in terms of the fact that, yes, we have worked together for a long time, and this is the way we interact. I'm sorry, I've got to interview somebody here in about 30 seconds.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you so much.
Right,
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Well, we have a couple of minutes left, and James, if you wanted to finish your thought, please go ahead.
No, it's largely that. It's because that's basically what I don't want to do. I understand that there's an obvious relationship to be drawn in the fact that arts can make, they can communicate science in a different way. And when I say communicate, I don't talk about literal products that can then be communicated in a different way. I'm talking about the whole way that we try and embrace the problem in the first place. I think at the moment science has their rigid structure, as we kind of addressed at the start, and at the moment I think it's a very inward-looking kind of, or not the entire community. It's unfair to paint them all with the same brush, but most science is often conducted, I think, for their own scientific community. And then there are some people that look outward and try and spread that message. And I think by engaging with artists and other people from other disciplines, what you do is you convince more people to look outward and convey the message and understanding that we have. So I think that's the thing. I want to talk to artists because I want to their worldview or the way that they consider, or the way that they see the problems that we're trying to address. So that's basically what I was trying to get at.
I just want to say a couple of things really quickly, because James, and I hope I don't misquote you, but you said something like, we pretty much know what the whole situation is. And I think that's not quite true. And I think the goal of transdisciplinarity and what Jim was trying to get at is that there's stuff that comes up in the conversation that wouldn't come up and is new and does lead to new directions. And in an interview I did on Monday, I compared that process to landscape painting. When I was a very young artist and was learning how to do landscape painting, my teacher told me to go to wherever I was going to be painting that day and discover the story. And I think that is what we're still trying to do. That is very much what Jim and I are trying to do. What is the story in the landscape we're looking at? I'm not sure who said, it might have been you, James, that one of the things that an artist does is we make visible what's invisible. And I think everything that we've been talking about is about this invisible, self-destructing system that we're all trapped in. And it's not exactly the same as illustration for an artist to end up trying to bring that out of the shadows. It crosses over someplace between making the invisible visible and finding new knowledge. And I think that's what we're trying to do. And so, Mary Jo, I'm going to let you have the last word on this, because you came in with really specific questions and observations, and I'd be very interested in hearing what your conclusions were from today.
Well, I think it was just really helpful to talk to everybody and kind of ask the questions. And obviously, these are our major concerns that I'm struggling with in my book as well. How effective is everything? Where is the activism? Where are the places for the activism? And that's one of the reasons I chose your Blue Trees project, because you have moved, from restoration to activism, and in very, very, in a very aggressive way. So I'm particularly interested in how that happened in the transition, and that's why I'm working with in the chapter on your area. But in terms of James, I would just say keep reaching out to artists beyond the idea of having them somehow illustrate what already exists. I mean, I know that it almost makes one feel defensive to have someone say that to you, but I think that you're not the only one. I think that is primarily the way that scientists do look at artists, even at MIT, where probably there is the most interaction between artists and scientists within their programs. But even there, they're not working on climate as much as they should. The emphasis at MIT is on technology. And technology is great, but, if that's all artists and scientists are doing at MIT, it's a shame. You know, they need to be thinking about the plants, they need to be thinking about living systems as well. And I don't see that happening in the MIT program. So, you know, are you teaching somewhere, James?
No, I'm a researcher.
Okay. Are you with a university, particular university?
Yeah, I'm at Oregon State.
Oregon State, okay. So maybe that's something that you can work on there. You know, isn't Oregon State, Aviva, one of the places where they have a lot of community-based art?
I think Beverly is indirectly connected to them.
But I mean, isn't that an institution where they really emphasize that? I mean, that might be a way for you to go and talk to the people who are running the community-based art program, teaching artists how to reach out to the community, to see how that might work with some of the scientific information that you're trying to get out more into the community. That might be a really productive.
Yeah, I'm part of a group here that does
work.
that. Yeah, I'm part of the university group here that does that as well.
So you know about the community-based art people at Oregon State?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, good, great.
Well, James, I was delighted that you could join us, and Mary
Oh,
Jo,
well, thank you.
Mary Jo, sorry. Of course, I'm delighted that you could join us as well.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure and an honor. And perhaps you'll join us on another day.
Love to.
Okay.
Love to. Thank you.
All right.
Do you and I need to talk after this?
Oh, yeah, let me stay on. James, we'll say
Yeah.
goodbye, and Mary Jo and I have a couple things to talk about.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Nice to talk to the both of you.
Bye, James.
Thanks again,
Stay in touch.
James.